point, we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about more of the logistics and objectives of what we're trying to accomplish with these daily flood threat outlooks. So let's step forward here. So the motivation for this program is, in short, is that it's pretty darn hard to predict flooding. So over the 2016 to 2021 warm seasons, and I'm referring to warm season as that May 1 through September 30 period. Excuse me. So each season, each of our forecast seasons has 153 days. So over that 6-year period, there are 918 days of forecast days. And so over that time, there were 361 days where rain intensity somewhere in the state either produced or could have produced flooding. And so we're going to discuss what that could have produced part means in a second. And now, so 361, so keep that number in mind. So 85 of those days had flash flood watches issued by the Weather Service. So as we'll talk about in a little bit here, the flash flood watch is essentially your higher lead time product where you have some kind of heads up as to whether or not flooding is possible that day. So if you divide 85 by 361, you have about a 1 in 4 flood days. So days that could have produced or produced flooding. 1 in 4 had significant lead time in anticipating heavy rainfall. And if we kind of drill it down into yearly stats, so 153 forecast days, there are only about 14 flash flood watches that are on average issued per season. So 1 out of 10 days roughly. And whereas we see about 60 flood days out of 153. So almost every, actually more than 1 in 3 days over that warm season in Colorado is considered a flood day where we have rainfall that could have produced flooding. And so the whole point of this product is to essentially issue threats on those marginal days. So we're definitely not trying to throw the National Weather Service under the bus here. But as we'll talk about in a second, it's really, we're taking a different approach. And let's step forward, Alyssa, and talk about the different approaches here. So the first thing to note here is that we consider the Weather Service as the authority when it comes to issuing anything in real time. So, and what do those real-time products mean in terms of when it comes to heavy rainfall? So there are 2 primary products that describe the vast majority of those issued by the Weather Service. It's the flash flood warning, and then it's the aerial flood advisory. So how are those products characterized? So that the unfortunate part about the product is that it essentially has 0 lead time. So in other words, there's little time for preparation. But the big upside to that product is that there's both a low false alarm rate and a low miss rate. So let's talk briefly about what that means. A false alarm rate is when you say something is going to happen, when you say it's going to flood and it doesn't flood. So that's not desirable because what it does is it lowers the sensitivity with which your end users interpret your forecast. So in other words, if you say that it's going to flood every single day and it happens 1 out of 10 times, people are probably not going to listen to you. So that's a problem. Now on the flip side, if you miss events, so basically something happens and you don't issue a forecast saying flooding is going to happen, then you're also impacting your credibility because essentially, misses are a big deal because if something happens and you didn't predict it, it's a poor forecast also. Now, the tricky thing when it comes to being a forecaster is that it's very difficult to lower the false alarm rate and the miss rate at the same time. So I'll say that again. It's really hard to say that it's really hard to be picky about your forecast without sacrificing misses. And that's the balance that we try. So what the approach that the Weather Service takes is that they are extremely concerned about not crying wolf. So they want a low false alarm rate. So they do an excellent job for the larger scale flood threats when it covers multiple counties or when it's a prolonged event. The major downside with that approach is that there is a fairly high miss rate, or as we saw in that previous slide, essentially 3 out of 4 days where flooding either occurred or could have occurred doesn't have any kind of product from the Weather Service that has any lead time with it. And so that's the bridge that we're trying to gap, is we're trying to address those more marginal events mainly that are still potentially dangerous, and we're trying to provide at least some number of hours of lead time with the forecast. So I think the takeaway here is that our product, sorry, Alyssa, can you, yeah, thanks. Our product is more comparable to the flash flood watch as opposed to the advisory or the warning. And we have no, I guess we do not try to do anything on that real-time warning level. And so we leave all of that up to the Weather Service. Anything that's happening in real time, we are not responsible for or are trying to cover, because it's too difficult to do without having a big team and experience like the Weather Service does. So I think that's the main takeaway there. So let's step forward. So now sorry, what was that? Okay. So now we briefly discussed what we mean by when something can produce flooding or flooding occurred. So now let's talk about some numbers. So what our product is designed to do is it's essentially built on a number of thresholds across various durations. And by far the most important threshold that we deal with is the 1 hour threshold. And what we do is we split the state into two different regions. And in the far eastern areas where the terrain is a little bit gentler, there's less slope, it's more sandy, we use a 1.5 inch per hour threshold for identifying whether or not something classifies as a flood day. And across central and western areas, that threshold moves down to 1 inch per hour. And the rationale for these numbers is essentially there's all kinds of literature available. It's loosely called flash flood guidance. And actually you can find flash flood guidance products issued by the Weather Service. And these numbers here, the 1 inch an hour across central and western areas and 1.5 inches per hour across eastern areas, these represent conservative estimates of flash flood guidance. And again, the rationale for that is that we want to be on the conservative side. We want to tell you about potential for flooding, and we want to really minimize our misses. And so by default, what that will mean is that we're going to have a few false alarms. But I guess the whole point we're trying to achieve is we're trying to achieve a reliable system where if we say there's a low threat, then you can kind of back out what the odds of flooding are. We'll discuss that in a bit. So just to run through the rest of these numbers here, we use 1 3/4 inches of rainfall in 3 hours across central and western areas, and 3 inches in 3 hours across eastern areas. And then at the 24-hour duration, we use 2 3/4 across central and western areas and 4.5 inches out east. And again, just like we discussed with a different flavor of flooding events, something around 80+% of all of our events are going to be driven by that 1 hour duration that doesn't make it to the 3 hour level, but it could still produce enough water to run off and cause flash flooding. And then lastly, just wanted to point out that we do verify not just with rainfall, but also with actual on the ground flooding reports using local storm reports. And even we have our own report of flood feature that Alyssa will discuss. So let's move on here. So this is kind of a summary of the different threats that you will see in our flood threat bulletin. So it's a 5-tier category system. The threats go from none to low to moderate to high impact. And then there's a 6th category, which is called NWS warning. And what that does is it tracks ongoing riverine flood warnings. So not flash flood warnings, but ongoing flood warnings at the riverine level, which are typically fairly long duration. And that's why we do that, because typical flash flood warnings only last for 30 to 60 to 90 minutes, whereas the riverine flood warnings could be on the order of days. So they're a little bit more trackable in our type of product. And just real quick to discuss what the threats mean. So the threats can be translated to an expected probability of flooding. And before, when we first started doing this, it was difficult for even ourselves to grasp what kind of probabilities we're dealing with. But through the tools that we have built over the years and just more understanding of the heavy rainfall climatology about forecasting, we're now fairly comfortable with issuing these probabilities. And so essentially, when we say no threat, there's a less than 10% chance on a county scale that you'll experience flooding conditions. A low threat means 10 to 30%, and the range there may seem kind of big, but that just means it's just supposed to take into account the differing county sizes. So something like Weld County, obviously, if we issue a threat for Weld County, it'll be easier for it to verify. And so it could be closer to the 30%, whereas a much smaller county could be on the order of 10%. So that's a low threat. The moderate threat is going to be up in the 30 to 60% range, so almost a 1 and 2. And then finally, when we say high threat, it's more likely than not that that county will experience flooding somewhere in the county. And the kind of the category on top of that is the high threat, but also impactful, which we call high impact. And that's a situation where there's let's say a big urban area. So if it's in the Denver, Colorado Springs, or any other bigger city, we'll put out a high impact threat because there's a particularly severe threat to life and property. So those are our categories that you'll see. And these things are always evolving, and I think for the time being we're fairly content. But based on user input, we are absolutely willing to tweak things to make it more understandable.